Speaking of woke, guess whose head is on the chopping block now? The bard, William Shakespeare. Get this, Shakespeare has made theatre too white, male, heterosexual and cisgender, claims new taxpayer-funded study. So now this guy's head is on the chopping block. And this was an £800,000 project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And this is what their researchers have come up with, basically saying we've made this a normative trend by mounting productions where he's front and centre all the time. He's just the most prolific playwright in the world. I'm so sorry he's white. We really apologise for that.
We've lost.
What are we supposed to do?
We've lost the plot. And the researchers, in response to all of this, have decided that the best way to counteract this supposed, racism and sexism and whatever that Shakespeare, notably one of the best playwrights of all time, has wrought upon the theatre, is to platform a play by a dude called John Lyly, who, by the way, is also white, but wrote a play back in the day. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare. Wrote a play called Galathea, which centres around this idea that girls are essentially sacrificed once a year. So a number of girls in this play dress up as boys in order to avoid being sacrificed, right? So this is apparently going to right all the wrongs of Shakespeare because they found one play that was written around the same time that involved girls dressing up as boys. We've fixed it. There's probably a reason you've never heard of John Lyly, and that's because he wasn't as good as William Shakespeare.
I just think it's hilarious they spent £800,000 to do a study to discover that the Elizabethan population of England was mostly white, able-bodied and, heteronormative.
Can't have it. Unacceptable.
Imagine if they'd spent £1 million, they would have also found there were no internal combustion engines, no mobile phones, and electricity was exceedingly rare back in the day.
What were you expecting of people and a playwright that was born in the 16th century, right? And what they forget, of course, is, sure, back then you might have had elements of sexism and racism involved in the world. Who would have thought? But the work that Shakespeare done was groundbreaking at the time, and the contribution he made to the English language, the way he changed the English language, he was far more progressive than anyone else who was around at the time. He changed the world in terms of language and theatre, etc. And now we want to be told that he was just upholding the traditional value. No, he was breaking down those barriers, literally rewriting the way things are done with his work. It just makes sense.
Yeah, but he was white, okay?
Well, that's right.
Was
but
white,
so was John Lyly.
And for that, he cannot be forgiven.
He's been blacklisted.
To Sydney now, where the Catholic Archbishop Anthony Fisher has warned people, quite rightly, this is not something that will be news to anyone who watches Sky News. He's warned that the role of religion in Australia is under attack. Let's not hear it from me, let's hear it from him. Here he was speaking earlier on Credlin this evening.
We've seen a series of cases where an archbishop was dragged before a tribunal for teaching what his church teaches about marriage, where a guy lost his job as a leader of a bank because of the church he belonged to. We've had pressures from governments to implement some radical sexuality and gender programs in some states, on hospitals to provide abortions, even if they're church hospitals, or euthanasia. And now there's this trend in government reports. Now, the Law Reform Commission one is obviously hostile to faith schools, but it's not alone. We had one from the Productivity Commission recently, which was against people who make donations to church building, school building funds, having tax deductibility.
This is, of course, very topical since the Albanese government has already told the opposition we're only going to bring up this whole Religious Discrimination Act type bill unless you guys support us, therefore putting it on to them, the responsibility of the government. We already know that they're looking at stripping back any religious schools' rights under the Sex Discrimination Act and then saying, no, don't worry, we'll cover it off when whatever rights are left for you guys in said new Religious Discrimination Act. Now, it's all very murky, and anyone who's read the fine print in either the Act or this supposed bill knows that it's anything but granting freedoms to religious institutions. And again, as I always say whenever this comes up again, who made you guys the boss of what religious bodies can and can't believe and practice, which is what the Archbishop is very politely saying, being like, you guys don't get to put our noose around our necks saying when and where and why we can gather, in what manner and to do what.
It's interesting we're talking about this right after laughing about the CIA going woke and so on and so forth. Anyone who still believes that the state is neutral is obviously not paying attention, because the state has values, ethics and core beliefs. They are diversity, inclusion, equity, and you look at something like LGBTQ, right? So
state religion.
You're not allowed to say that homosexuality is a sin, or you'll be punted from rugby union, or you'll be taken to the discrimination tribunal like Justin Porteous, the Archbishop of Hobart, was. Well, that's a belief, but it's increasingly a belief that's held by the state, and the state enforces its belief upon everybody, including religious institutions. There was a time many decades ago when Christianity was regarded as a public good, and it was that was not a controversial thing. Then it was sort of neutral. These days, Christianity is increasingly regarded by the state as harmful, and there'll come a day where it's regarded as dangerous. There's a quote from Francis George, who was the Archbishop of Chicago. He said to a gathering of priests a few years ago, "I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison. His successor will die a martyr in the public square, and his successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help to rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history." Now, when he said that a few years ago, I think people thought he was sort of exaggerating, but you look at the way the Western world is going and how Christians are increasingly being pushed out of the public square, out of corporate jobs, as Anthony Fisher described there with bank officials. You're an AFL fan. You would have followed Andrew Thorburn, who was kicked out of his Essendon job. You can well imagine a day where it's almost impossible to espouse Christian beliefs, which 5 minutes ago were non-controversial.
Well, it already is.
And keep your job.
It already is.
And this is why I have such an issue with legislating rights, anyone's rights, because one person's rights will always impinge upon someone else's rights. Rights should just exist. They don't need to be legislated. Everything is legal until it is made illegal. Religious freedom and any other freedom should not be legislated, but it should never be legislated against. That is the situation in which you have fundamental rights, but they don't do that.
And who are they legislating against?
Correct.
It's always the faith-based fill in the gap. And what I want to know, just before we go to a break, because I know that expression, is what are you going to do? Because there's billions of us, Christians, Catholics, Muslims, with a lot of things we are on a unity ticket sometimes when it comes to values-based, faith-based issues, and the Jewish people. When it comes to especially LGBTIQ things, which is what most of this legislation, putting the nails in us and trying to protect their rights, speak to. We're the ones on a unity ticket, and there's billions of us, and we're going nowhere. So it's not going to work. Try your hardest, do your darndest. It's not going to work.